Maria Santos had always been smaller than the other recruits at Fort Jackson. At 5 feet 2 inches and barely 110 pounds, she looked more like a college student than someone trying to earn her place among the Army's finest. But what she lacked in size, she made up for in determination that burned like fire in her dark eyes. The trouble started on her third week of basic training. Drill Sergeant Kevin Hayes had taken notice of Maria, but not in the way she hoped. He seemed to find pleasure in singling her out during every exercise, every inspection, every moment he could make her life difficult. "Santos," his voice boomed across the training ground that Tuesday morning. "You call that a push-up? My grandmother could do better. And she's been dead for 10 years. The other recruits tried not to look as Maria dropped down to repeat the exercise. Her arms shook with exhaustion, but she pushed through 20 more perfect push-ups. When she finished, Sergeant Hayes just shook his head and moved on to torment someone else. Maria came from a family of fighters. Her father, Miguel, had been a boxer in Mexico before moving to Texas to work construction. Her mother, Rosa, cleaned office buildings at night to help pay the bills. They had sacrificed everything to give Maria and her two younger brothers a better life in America. "Mia," her father had told her the night before she left for basic training, "the world will try to break you because you are small, because you are a woman, because you are different. But remember, the strongest steel comes from the hottest fire." Those words echoed in Maria's mind as she endured week after week of Sergeant Hayes's special attention. He made her carry extra gear during marches. He assigned her the worst duties in the barracks. He found fault with everything she did, no matter how perfectly she performed. The other recruits began to notice. Some felt sorry for Maria, but most were just grateful the sergeant's anger wasn't directed at them. A few, like Tommy Chen from California and Ashley Williams from Georgia, tried to help Maria when they could. They would share their rations when the sergeant made her skip meals, or help clean her gear when she was assigned extra duties that kept her up all night. "Why doesn't she just quit?" whispered recruits in the darkness of their bunks. "Anyone can see Hayes has it out for her." But Maria never complained. She never cried, at least not where anyone could see. She just kept pushing forward, day after day, week after week. Her body grew stronger, her reflexes faster, her mind sharper. She was becoming exactly the kind of soldier the Army needed, but Sergeant Hayes seemed determined to break her before she could prove it. The real trouble began during combat training in the 4th week. The recruits were learning hand-to-hand combat techniques in the training gym. The room smelled of sweat and rubber mats, with fluorescent lights buzzing overhead. Sergeant Hayes paired the recruits for sparring practice, always making sure to give Maria the biggest, strongest opponents. "Combat isn't fair, Santos," he would say with a cruel smile. "The enemy won't go easy on you because you're tiny." Maria held her own against recruits twice her size. She was quick and smart, using her opponent's strength against them. She had learned some moves from her father, who had taught her to defend herself growing up in a rough neighborhood. But more than that, she had natural instincts that couldn't be taught. During one particularly intense session, Maria was paired with Derek Morrison, a huge recruit from Montana who had played football in high school. Derek outweighed Maria by more than 100 pounds and stood nearly a foot taller. As they sparred, Derek got frustrated that he couldn't pin down the smaller recruit who kept slipping away from his grasp. "Hold still, Santos," Derek grunted, lunging forward with more force than the training required. Maria sidestepped smoothly and used Derek's momentum to send him tumbling across the mat. The other recruit stopped to watch as Derek got up, his face red with embarrassment and anger. This time when he came at Maria, there was real aggression in his movements. "Morrison," Sergeant Hayes barked, "control yourself." But Derek was past listening. He grabbed Maria and lifted her off her feet, planning to slam her down on the mat with enough force to knock the wind out of her. It was then that something awakened in Maria, something that had been building through weeks of harassment and unfair treatment. As Derek raised her above his head, Maria twisted like a cat and wrapped her legs around his neck. Using a technique her father had shown her years ago, she applied pressure to specific points that cut off blood flow to Derek's brain. Within seconds, the much larger man collapsed to the mat, unconscious. The gym fell silent except for the sound of heavy breathing. Every recruit stared at Maria, who stood calmly over Derek's unconscious form. Even Sergeant Hayes looked shocked. Derek came to a few seconds later, confused and embarrassed. "How did you do that?" Ashley Williams whispered later in the barracks. Maria just shrugged. "My father taught me that size doesn't matter if you know where to press." But her display of skill had consequences. Sergeant Hayes became even more determined to break her spirit. He began waking her up in the middle of the night for special inspections of her gear. He made her clean the bathrooms with a toothbrush. He forced her to do extra drills while the other recruits rested. "You think you're special, Santos?" he would hiss when no one else could hear. "You think you're tougher than everyone else? I'm going to show you exactly how special you are." The harassment escalated day by day. Sergeant Hayes began timing Maria's runs and claiming she was too slow, even when she finished first. He inspected her bunk with a magnifying glass, finding dust particles that existed only in his imagination. He made her redo tasks over and over until her hands bled from gripping equipment too long. Other drill sergeants began to notice Hayes's behavior, but military protocol made it difficult for them to intervene directly. Sergeant Patricia Coleman, one of the few female drill instructors, tried to counsel Maria privately. "I've been watching what's happening," Sergeant Coleman said during a rare moment when they were alone. "Hayes is pushing boundaries that shouldn't be pushed. You don't have to endure this alone." Maria appreciated the concern, but she had made her decision. "I can handle myself, Sergeant. I didn't come here to be protected. I came here to prove I belong." Sergeant Coleman nodded with respect, but worried about how far Hayes might push things. She had seen his type before. Men who felt threatened by strong women and tried to crush them rather than accept them as equals. The breaking point came during the 6th week of training. The recruits were practicing defensive maneuvers in full combat gear. The exercise was supposed to simulate being captured by enemy forces, with drill sergeants playing the role of hostile captors. Sergeant Hayes had designed a special scenario just for Maria. While the other recruits faced standard procedures, he had created something much more aggressive. When Maria's turn came, Hayes and 2 other instructors surrounded her in a way that felt less like training and more like a real attack. "You're captured, Santos," Hayes announced with satisfaction in his voice. "Let's see how tough you really are when you can't use your little tricks." What happened next would change everything for Maria and expose the true character of everyone involved. The other recruits watched nervously as the exercise began, sensing that something was different this time. The tension in the room was thick enough to cut with a knife. Ashley Williams caught Tommy Chen's eye across the training area. Both of them had the same worried expression. They had seen Hayes push Maria for weeks, but this felt different. This felt dangerous. "Should we do something?" Ashley whispered. Tommy shook his head grimly. "What can we do? He's the drill sergeant." But they both knew they were about to witness something that would test every principle they had learned about honor, duty, and protecting fellow soldiers. The exercise was about to begin, and Maria stood alone in the center of the mat, surrounded by men who seemed more like predators than instructors. Her father's words echoed in her mind once more. "The strongest steel comes from the hottest fire." Maria had no idea how prophetic those words would prove to be in the next few minutes. She was about to face the hottest fire of her life, and everyone in that room was about to discover exactly what kind of steel she was made of. The moment of truth was approaching, and Maria Santos was ready for it. The training room felt like a coliseum as Maria stood in the center, surrounded by Sergeant Hayes and 2 other instructors. The fluorescent lights cast harsh shadows across their faces, making them look more menacing than usual. The other recruits formed a circle around the exercise area, their eyes wide with nervous anticipation. "The scenario is simple, Santos," Sergeant Hayes announced loudly enough for everyone to hear. "You've been captured behind enemy lines. Your captors want information, and they're not going to be gentle about getting it. Your job is to resist and escape if possible." Maria nodded, understanding the drill. She had trained for this kind of scenario, though something about Hayes's tone made her stomach tighten with unease. The other 2 instructors, Staff Sergeant Williams and Corporal Rodriguez, exchanged glances that suggested they weren't entirely comfortable with what was about to happen. "Remember," Hayes continued, his eyes fixed on Maria with an intensity that felt personal, "the enemy won't care that you're small. They won't care that you're a woman. They'll use every advantage they have to break you. The exercise began with Maria being roughly grabbed and forced to the ground. This was standard procedure for prisoner simulation training. But Hayes took it further than necessary, his hands gripping her arms with excessive force as he shoved her face down onto the mat. "Where are your unit's positions?" he barked, kneeling on her back with his full weight. Maria gave the standard response for such training: name, rank, and serial number only. But Hayes wasn't satisfied with standard responses. He grabbed her hair and yanked her head up, his breath hot against her ear. "Wrong answer, Santos. Maybe some time on the ground will help you remember your manners." What happened next crossed every line of appropriate training protocol. Hayes slammed Maria's face back down onto the mat with unnecessary violence, then gestured for the other instructors to join him in restraining her. The weight of 3 grown men pressed down on her small frame as Hayes continued his interrogation. "I said, where are your unit's positions?" His voice had taken on an edge that had nothing to do with training and everything to do with personal animosity. The watching recruits began to shift uncomfortably. This wasn't training anymore, this was something else entirely. Ashley Williams bit her lip to keep from speaking out, knowing that intervention could end her own military career before it started. Tommy Chen clenched his fists, every instinct telling him to help Maria, but military hierarchy and protocol held him back. Staff Sergeant Williams, one of the men helping restrain Maria, began to look concerned. "Sergeant Hayes," he said quietly, "maybe we should—" "I'll decide when we should," Hayes cut him off sharply. "Santos here thinks she's special, thinks she can handle anything we throw at her. Let's see if that's true." Maria's face was pressed against the rough mat, making it difficult to breathe with the combined weight on her back. But her mind remained clear and focused. She could feel Hayes's hands on her in ways that went beyond necessary restraint. She could hear the change in his breathing, the personal satisfaction in his voice. This wasn't about training. It was about power and dominance. For weeks, she had endured his harassment and abuse, telling herself it was just part of the process. She had convinced herself that keeping quiet and pushing through was the right path. But lying there under the weight of 3 men, feeling Hayes's hands where they shouldn't be, something shifted inside Maria Santos. Her father's voice echoed in her memory, but this time it brought different words. Words he had spoken when she was 16, and a boy at school had tried to force himself on her. "Mija, there is a difference between being strong and being a victim. Sometimes the strongest thing you can do is fight back." The realization hit Maria like lightning. She wasn't being tested or trained. She was being assaulted. And no amount of military protocol or career ambition was worth enduring that in silence. "Get off me," she said clearly, her voice cutting through the heavy breathing of the men above her. Hayes laughed. "That's not how this works, Santos. You don't give orders here." "I said get off me." Maria's voice was stronger now, and she began to struggle against their restraints. "Hold her still," Hayes instructed the other men, but both Staff Sergeant Williams and Corporal Rodriguez were beginning to realize that something was very wrong with this situation. That's when Maria Santos revealed exactly what kind of person she truly was. Using a technique her father had taught her for exactly this kind of situation, Maria suddenly relaxed her entire body, making the men think she had given up. The moment their grip loosened slightly, she exploded into motion with the speed and precision of a striking snake. Her elbow shot backward into Hayes' solar plexus with enough force to double him over. As he gasped for breath and his weight lifted, Maria rolled sideways and swept her leg in an arc that took out Staff Sergeant Williams at the ankles. In the same fluid motion, she grabbed Corporal Rodriguez's wrist and twisted it in a way that sent shooting pain up his arm, forcing him to release his hold on her. In less than 3 seconds, Maria had gone from being completely restrained by 3 men to standing free in the center of the mat while all 3 of her captors were on the ground, groaning in pain. The room fell into absolute silence. Every recruit stared with their mouths open. Even the other drill sergeants who had been observing from the sidelines looked stunned. Maria stood in the center of it all, her chest rising and falling rapidly, her dark eyes blazing with a fire that no one had seen before. Sergeant Hayes struggled to his feet, his face red with rage and embarrassment. "Santos," he roared, You just assaulted a superior officer. No, Maria said with deadly calm. I defended myself from assault. The words hung in the air like a challenge. Everyone in the room knew that what had just happened went far beyond normal training parameters. They had all witnessed something that would force them to choose sides. You little... Hayes started forward, his hands clenched into fists. But Sergeant Patricia Coleman's voice cut across the room like a whip. Stand down. Sergeant Hayes? Coleman had been observing from the doorway and had seen everything. Her face was pale but determined as she entered the training area. Behind her came Captain James Morrison, the company commander, who had also witnessed the final moments of the encounter. Everyone except Santos, report to the far side of the room, Captain Morrison ordered in a voice that brooked no argument. The recruits scrambled to obey, leaving Maria standing alone in the center while the officers assessed the situation. Sergeant Hayes, Captain Morrison said quietly, step into my office, now. Hayes's face went through several shades of red and purple as he realized that his abuse of Maria had finally been witnessed by someone with the authority to stop it. He started to speak, but Morrison held up a hand. Not one word, Sergeant. Office. Now. As Hayes stalked out of the training room, shooting venomous looks at Maria, the tension began to drain from the air. But Maria remained standing at attention, unsure what consequences her actions might bring. Sergeant Coleman approached her slowly. Santos, are you injured? No, Sergeant, Maria replied crisply, though her arms bore red marks from Hayes's grip. Good. Coleman paused, studying Maria's face. What happened here today was not training. You understand that, right? Maria met her eyes steadily. Yes, Sergeant. I understand. Captain Morrison returned without Hayes and addressed the room. What happened here today will be investigated thoroughly. In the meantime, training will continue under Sergeant Coleman's supervision. Santos, I need to speak with you privately. As the other recruits filed out, many of them looked at Maria with new respect. Ashley Williams caught her eye and mouthed, "Thank you," before leaving. Tommy Chen nodded with admiration. They had all learned something important about courage that day. But Maria's ordeal was far from over. Standing up to Hayes had been just the beginning. Now she would face military justice, investigation procedures, and the challenge of proving that her actions were justified. Some would see her as a hero, others as a troublemaker who couldn't follow orders. Captain Morrison studied her for a long moment. Santos, what you did today took remarkable skill and courage, but it's also going to complicate your military career significantly. Are you prepared for what comes next? Maria thought of her parents, who had sacrificed so much to give her opportunities. She thought of her little brothers, who looked up to her as their example of what was possible in America. She thought of all the other women who would come after her, who might face similar situations. Yes, sir, she said firmly. I'm prepared. But even Maria couldn't have imagined just how far-reaching the consequences of her actions would be. Her moment of defiance was about to spark changes that would ripple through the entire military structure, touching lives she had never met, and inspiring courage in places she would never see. The hardest battles, she was about to learn, were often fought not against foreign enemies, but against the systems and people who were supposed to protect you. The investigation into the incident began immediately. Captain Morrison had called in Colonel Sarah Mitchell, the base commander, along with investigators from the military police. The training room that had witnessed Maria's explosive moment of self-defense became a crime scene, with officers taking photographs and measurements while questioning every witness. Maria found herself in an uncomfortable position. Military protocol demanded respect for the chain of command, but she had physically overpowered a drill sergeant in front of dozens of witnesses. Even though everyone present knew that Hayes had crossed the line, the fact remained that she had used force against a superior officer. Tell me exactly what happened, Private Santos, Colonel Mitchell said during Maria's formal interview. The colonel was a stern woman in her 50s who had fought her own battles to reach her position in a male-dominated military. Maria recounted the events with precise detail, leaving nothing out. She described weeks of escalating harassment, the inappropriate nature of the training exercise, and her decision to defend herself when the situation became clearly abusive. Why didn't you report Sergeant Hayes's behavior earlier? Colonel Mitchell asked. Ma'am, I thought it was part of the training. I thought I was supposed to endure it and prove I could handle anything. Maria paused, choosing her words carefully. I realize now that there's a difference between tough training and abuse. The colonel nodded grimly. This wasn't the first case of drill instructor misconduct she had investigated, but it was the first where a recruit had been skilled enough to effectively fight back. Meanwhile, the other recruits were being interviewed individually. Their testimonies painted a clear picture of systematic harassment and abuse. Ashley Williams tearfully described watching Maria being tormented day after day, wishing she had been brave enough to speak up. Tommy Chen admitted that he had wanted to help, but feared ruining his own military career. Santos never complained, testified Derek Morrison, the recruit who had been knocked unconscious by Maria during sparring. She just kept taking it and getting stronger. What Hayes did to her wasn't training. It was personal. The most damaging testimony came from Staff Sergeant Williams and Corporal Rodriguez, the two instructors who had been ordered to help restrain Maria. Both men had decades of military experience and knew the difference between appropriate training and abuse. The exercise was supposed to last 5 minutes maximum, Staff Sergeant Williams testified. Standard prisoner simulation training has clear protocols. What Sergeant Hayes was doing had nothing to do with military training. Corporal Rodriguez was even more direct. I've conducted hundreds of these exercises. Hayes was using the scenario as an excuse to assault Private Santos. When I tried to question the procedures, he shut me down aggressively. As the investigation continued, a disturbing pattern emerged. Hayes had a history of complaints from female recruits, but previous investigations had been inconclusive. The military's old boy network had protected him, with commanders accepting his claims that the women simply couldn't handle tough training. Maria's case was different because of one crucial factor. She had been able to defend herself effectively. Her father's training and her natural fighting instincts had allowed her to do what no previous victim had been able to do: physically stop the abuse and force witnesses to confront what was really happening. Colonel Mitchell made a decision that would send ripples throughout the military hierarchy. Instead of pursuing charges against Maria for assaulting a superior officer, she chose to fast-track the investigation into Hayes's conduct. She also implemented immediate changes to training protocols to prevent similar incidents. Private Santos, the colonel said during their final interview, your actions have exposed a serious problem in our training system. While I cannot officially condone physically overpowering a drill instructor, I can acknowledge that you were defending yourself against assault. The official findings were released 3 weeks later. Sergeant Kevin Hayes was court-martialed for abuse of authority, assault, and conduct unbecoming a non-commissioned officer. The evidence against him was overwhelming, and his previous complaints were reopened for investigation. During the court-martial proceedings, Maria testified with the same calm precision she had shown throughout the investigation. Hayes's defense attorney tried to paint her as an insubordinate recruit who couldn't handle military discipline, but the evidence told a different story. Private Santos endured 6 weeks of escalating abuse while maintaining exemplary performance in all other areas of training, the prosecutor stated. She attempted to handle the situation through proper military bearing until Sergeant Hayes's conduct became clearly criminal. The most powerful moment came when Maria's training records were presented to the court. Despite Hayes's constant harassment, her scores in every area were in the top 5% of her class. She had excelled in marksmanship, physical fitness, military knowledge, and leadership exercises while enduring treatment that would have broken many other recruits. Sergeant Hayes was found guilty on all charges and sentenced to reduction in rank, forfeiture of pay, and dishonorable discharge from the Army. The verdict sent a clear message throughout the military that abuse of power would not be tolerated. But the story didn't end with Hayes's conviction. Maria's actions had inspired changes that went far beyond one court-martial. Colonel Mitchell used the case to implement new training protocols that included mandatory reporting procedures for harassment, independent oversight of drill instructor conduct, and specific protections for recruits who reported abuse. The Santos case, as it became known in military circles, became a landmark example of how one person's courage could change an entire system. Maria's story was used in training programs to teach both recruits and instructors about appropriate boundaries and the importance of speaking up against abuse. The other recruits in Maria's class graduated with a new understanding of courage and integrity. Ashley Williams became a military police officer, inspired by Maria's example to protect others who couldn't protect themselves. Tommy Chen chose military intelligence, where his skills at observation and analysis helped identify and prevent misconduct. Maria herself graduated at the top of her class and was selected for advanced infantry training. Her drill instructors, now properly supervised and held accountable, respected her skills and dedication. She had proven that she belonged not through endurance of abuse, but through excellence in every aspect of military service. The most satisfying moment came during the graduation ceremony. Maria's parents had traveled from Texas to watch their daughter receive her honors. Miguel Santos, tears in his eyes, watched as his daughter was recognized not just as a survivor, but as a leader. "You remember what I told you about steel and fire?" he asked after the ceremony. Maria nodded, her own eyes bright with tears. "I was wrong, Mika. You were already strong steel. The fire just showed everyone else what I always knew." But perhaps the most important change was in how the military handled reports of harassment. The Santos Protocol, as it became informally known, established clear procedures for investigating complaints and protecting accusers from retaliation. Other victims found the courage to speak up, knowing that their reports would be taken seriously. 5 years later, now Sergeant Maria Santos, she returned to Fort Jackson as a drill instructor herself. But her approach was completely different from Hayes's methods. She was tough but fair, demanding but respectful, challenging her recruits to be their best without breaking their spirits. On her first day as a drill instructor, she addressed her new class of recruits with words that had become her personal creed. "I'm here to make you strong, not to break you down. There's a difference between tough training that builds character and abuse that destroys it. In my training company, we build warriors, not victims." Among her first class of recruits was a small, quiet young woman named Jennifer Kim, who reminded Maria of herself. Jennifer had already begun experiencing harassment from another instructor, but after hearing Maria's speech, she found the courage to report it immediately. The complaint was investigated promptly and thoroughly. The abusive instructor was removed and faced appropriate consequences. Jennifer continued her training in a safe environment and went on to become an exemplary soldier. After the successful resolution of Jennifer's case, the young woman approached Maria privately. "Sergeant Santos, I heard about what happened to you during basic training. Thank you for making it possible for people like me to be protected." Maria smiled, thinking of all the women who would come after Jennifer, who would serve their country without fear of abuse from those sworn to train them. "That's what we do for each other, soldier. We watch each other's backs." The ripple effects of that day in the training room continued to spread throughout the military. Policies changed, attitudes shifted, and accountability became the norm rather than the exception. Maria's moment of defiance had become a turning point, not just for her own life, but for the entire institution she had chosen to serve. Years later, when young recruits asked Maria about that famous incident, she would always tell them the same thing. "Courage isn't about being unafraid. It's about doing what's right even when you are afraid. And sometimes doing what's right means standing up to people who think their rank gives them the right to hurt you." Maria Santos had entered the army as a small young woman trying to prove she belonged. She became not just a soldier, but a catalyst for change, showing that true strength comes not from the ability to endure abuse, but from the courage to stand against it. The military was better for having people like Maria Santos in its ranks. Soldiers who understood that defending others from harm was just as important as defending the country from enemies. Her legacy lived on in every policy change, every protected recruit, and every drill instructor who chose to build up rather than tear down. In the end, Sergeant Hayes had been wrong about one crucial thing. Maria Santos was indeed special, not because she could endure abuse, but because she had the strength and courage to stop it. And in doing so, she had made the entire military stronger, safer, and more worthy of the trust placed in it by those who chose to serve.